Hi again, Neil, co-founder of ModeAudio here. So we've been introduced to Airspace's main features in my plugin walkthrough video, and now it's time to take a deeper dive into each of the plugin's main sections. We're going to start with colour and space, which as I explained in the walkthrough are in fact identical reverb modules. This allows us to combine and blend reverb flavours to a practically endless degree, and is the very heart of Airspace's sound design architecture. To briefly recap, colour and space are convolution reverb modules, which means that they use a bank of pre-recorded samples, or impulse responses, to multiply and fuse with your sounds and source audio. Airspace comes to you bundled with a bank of over 450 impulse responses, spanning a huge variety of different sounds and spaces, which can be broadly divided into two groups. Firstly, we have files that will make your source audio sound like it was recorded in a physical space, by either using samples specially prepared in real locations, or by using digital algorithms. Let's load one up so you can hear what I mean. Here's what an acoustic piano sounds like with the York Minster impulse response, one of my absolute favourites from the collection, applied. This gorgeous impulse response was genuinely recorded in York's famous cathedral, and you'll find many files like it recorded in real spaces and places within Airspace's impulse response library. Secondly, we have a group of impulse responses which are much more experimental and creative, which aim to truly transform your source sounds into something new and exciting. These files vary wildly in character, but here's what our piano recording sounds like with the Marbles 1 impulse response applied. I think this impulse makes it crystal clear how Airspace's convolution engines fuse together the sound of the input audio and impulse response sample, creating a genuine fusion of the two. So, now we have an overall understanding of what Airspace's colour and space sections do, let's take a look at their individual controls. Firstly, each of Airspace's three main sections can be bypassed by clicking their titles or associated switch icons. To reactivate, simply click anywhere within the grayed out area. Next to the titles, you will also notice a small volume dial which controls the output volume of the signal leaving each section. A meter accompanies this to give a visual representation of the volume of the output. When clipping occurs, which is when the signal goes above 0 dB, or in other words is a bit too loud, red dots will appear at the top of the meter. Use the section volume dial to reduce the level if this happens. Of course, you can also use this dial to boost the volume if you find things are a bit quiet. To return the dial to its default state, and this is true for all of Airspace's controls, simply double click. Here, this will return the volume dial to the 0 dB position. Another useful feature is for fine tuning of any of the plugin's controls, just hold down the shift key before clicking. Next, we have the impulse response selector menu. Click anywhere in the bar with the little downwards pointing arrow to open this drop down, which appears directly above the delay section. From here, all of Airspace's 450 plus impulse responses can be loaded into either colour or space. As I also mentioned in my walkthrough video, these samples are organised into 12 folders within the selector menu, with the 5 folders at the top being aimed at the colour section and the following 7 at the space section. This is because the top folders all contain short samples of typically around a second or less, intended for use in transforming the spectral character or colour of your source audio. The following folders contain longer samples of up to 16 seconds in length, intended for use in the space section. As you can see and hear in my preset walkthrough video, however, there's no restriction on which sample you can load in either colour or space, leaving you to get as creative as you dare. When we select a new impulse response from the menu, you can see that the title shown in the selector menu bar changes to reflect the freshly loaded sample, and the waveform display, located just beneath the bar, also updates to show you the waveform or shape of the sound. You'll also notice when clicking around the various folders that the samples in the bottom 6 all have numbers at the beginning of their titles. This indicates the length, in seconds, of the sample. Moving back to the waveform display, you can see a thin blue line surrounding the waveform itself. This is a graph showing you the curve of the amplitude envelope being applied to the impulse response. We'll get into this some more in a moment. At the bottom of the display, beneath the amplitude envelope curve and waveform, we have the IR EQ selector or switch, as well as the EQ on-off button. At the moment, the selector is set to IR, which is why we can see the waveform above. If we click EQ instead, we can bring up Colour and Space's EQ controls. At the moment, the Colour section's EQ is off or bypassed, which is why the controls are currently greyed out. If we click the EQ on button, or anywhere within the EQ section, the controls will become active. What we have here are the controls for a 4-band EQ, with each band having a separate gain dial and curved center frequency slider. On the left, we have a low shelf filter, which cuts or boosts the frequencies of the loaded impulse response below the frequency specified by the slider above. On the right, we have the opposite control, a high shelf filter, which instead cuts or boosts the frequencies above the value specified by the associated slider. In the middle, we have 2 notch filters, which cut or boost frequencies at the point specified by the curved center frequency sliders above. Broadly speaking, we can use the low shelf to boost or cut the bass present in the loaded impulse response. The high shelf can be used to control the treble, and the 2 notch filters can be used to target specific frequencies for boosting or cutting. As Airspace's impulse responses vary so extremely in character and spectrum, the EQ section is a very important tool for helping to shape the sound of the samples loaded into Colour and Space, to best complement the source sounds you choose to feed into the plugin. Let's have a quick listen to Colour's EQ in action. We can now move on to the grid of dials positioned beneath Colour and Space's waveform display. You'll notice these are divided into 2 sections. For Colour, it's 5 dials on the left and 3 dials on the right. For Space, this is reversed. Let's take a look at the group of 5 dials first. These are our amplitude envelope controls, which change the envelope that is applied to the loaded impulse response sample. These can chiefly be used to shorten the length of a sample, but we can also do more interesting things like create long, slow swells of sound by applying higher attack times and dial in exactly how we want our sound to fade out. The envelopes used in Colour and Space are attack, hold, release, or AHR envelopes. This means that the curve applied to the impulse response has an attack portion at the beginning, a hold phase at maximum volume, and finally a release portion at the end. Moving each of the attack, hold, or release dials at the top changes the shape of our amplitude envelope, which is reflected in the thin blue line plot I mentioned previously, located in the waveform display above. You'll notice that the values displayed beneath these dials also change as we use them, giving us updates of the actual time in milliseconds or seconds each portion of the envelope will last. These values will also change if a new impulse response is loaded using the menu. This is because every sample is a different overall length, and our amplitude envelope is relative to this length. Beneath attack, hold, and release, we have 2 further dials to help shape our amplitude envelope: pre-delay and end curve. Pre-delay simply applies a short delay of up to 250 milliseconds before the impulse response is applied to your source sound. This is an old psychoacoustic trick that often helps to give the impression of a bigger space or reverb at higher values. Finally, end curve or envelope curve lets us change our envelope from a linear curve to a logarithmic or, well, curvy one. This can create a more organic sounding result, though is usually most audible when higher attack and release settings are applied. Here's a quick demonstration of how these 5 dials affect Space's sound this time, and let's also change up our source sound to an analog synth pad. We now come to the second group of controls in this section, and the final group in Colour and Space overall. Of the 3 dials here, let's start at the top with Mix. Simply put, this dial mixes the dry, unaffected sound of your source audio in with the wet, affected sound produced by the Colour and Space sections. A vitally important control to these sections. You'll have noticed me using it a few times already earlier in the video, as it's a useful tool for comparing and checking how the impulse response is affecting your input. Beneath this control, we have our IR size dial, probably my favourite control in all of Airspace. What this dial does is it changes the playback speed of the loaded impulse response, effectively shortening or lengthening the file. This means we can transform the ting of a metal pan lid being struck into an epic wash of sound, or shrink down the vast sound of a Grade 1 listed cathedral to a brief whistle, should we choose to. The IR size control allows you to increase the perceived size of the loaded sample by up to a massive 500%, as well as shrink it down to just 20%. When we speed up or slow down a sound, as well as its length, we also change its colour and character, making this dial a very powerful sound design tool indeed. Let's listen to the effects of changing IR size on our source audio. Decreasing the size and shortening the impulse response creates a brighter sound, whereas increasing it produces a much darker result. If we want, we can then use the onboard EQ controls to adjust and shape the character of the resulting sound, for example by adding some treble sheen back into an impulse response that has been stretched out. You'll have noticed when I was changing the IR size that I was also making adjustments to the IR gain dial, the final control available to us in Colour and Space. This dial is used simply to boost or cut the gain of the impulse response sample itself, which is very handy given how the other controls can drastically affect the volume of the output signal. Another use for this control is that it will increase or decrease the prominence of the character of the impulse response in the output, whereas the section gain control makes the entire output signal, including the dry source audio, louder or quieter. So in other words, use the IR gain dial to increase or decrease how much the character of the impulse response affects the output of Colour or Space. There we have it, a deep dive into all that Airspace's Colour and Space sections have to offer your sound. From subtle spectral transformations to submerged ambient bliss, Airspace makes it all just a few clicks away. Check out my other videos covering delay and delay mod by visiting our ModeAudio TV YouTube channel, and to purchase the plugin or give the 15-day free trial a spin, please visit modeaudio.com/product/Airspace and have fun using Airspace.